When it comes to YouTube, I have posted so many videos of me showcasing some custom-built Lego trains. And over the years, I have had so many people comment basically the same thing. You should build this train or locomotive. Now that of course makes sense, because a lot of people will make that comment with the endearing nature of, you've got the bricks and the capability to make a train that I would like to build, but I can't do it, so I want to see you do it. I've had hundreds of these comments, and there were a few that I look at them and I go, that's not a bad idea, it's an interesting loco, I would like to try and build that one day, but I've never ever built a locomotive or any kind of train out of Lego that came from a suggestion. So not too long ago, I made a YouTube community post basically saying this, and it was an interesting idea to do a reaction video of sorts to see what kind of trains people want me to make. Now, I've, again, had loads of these comments in the past, and trying to gather them for this one video was going to be a nightmare task. So I made that new post to get all of these recommendations and suggestions and ideas for locomotives and trains people want to see me build out of Lego. So I have gathered all of the comments made from that particular post. I have them all here screenshotted, ready for me to react to. This is going to be a very interesting time. And before we begin, I know people are going to continue to make these comments. It's something that is just a thing that happens now. Again, I've had hundreds of these. This doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to take in any of this. I'm going to make something you suggest. I will build what I feel like I want to build. And that's how anybody in, well, Lego as a whole, really, they build what they want. Some people can give recommendations and that will inspire them to make their own design model. Not necessarily something that someone else basically demands them to make. So without further ado, this is me reacting to your Lego train suggestions. Oh boy, here we go. So the first one is from user This Is a Duck, and he says, make something with a boiler explosion. That would be pretty interesting to see and really push the limits of Lego, and it'd be funny to see it driving around. So first of all, such a model wouldn't actually be driven around the layout. That will be a set decoration at most, because a steam locomotive that has had a boiler explosion has all of the tubes inside of the boiler. They'd be all frayed and kind of spaghettiing outwards. And that would be a very cool visual, but again, it would be quite the challenge. It's not quite something I've thought of doing, and I could definitely see myself making a monster layout where there's a part that's been abandoned, there's a steam locomotive that's kind of been chipped at. Maybe one went wrong, again, the boiler exploded, so they just abandoned it, never mind scrapping it. So yeah, I mean, not a bad idea, but not quite what I'm into. Next is from user James Boxy, who says, an accurate movie-length Snowpiercer train that doesn't use Lego train motors, but rather perpetual motion or something. Having it move with perpetual motion. Yeah, I'm not that talented. But the Snowpiercer train is one I have had appear in the comments a lot. And it's, yeah, I can see the appeal. It's definitely its own cool thing. But it's not something I've seen. I haven't actually seen the film still. And again, I think after I see the film, I might have some more appreciation for that particular train. But I feel like that's going to be the next train that comes up in Lego train circles, where you see everybody build a Polar Express, a Hogwarts Express, so many popular and well-known trains. The Snowpiercer is one that doesn't quite fit into that category, but I reckon in time a few more people might give that a go. I mean, everybody knows it because of the train, so it's definitely possible, but not quite my cup of tea. The next one is from Naps Brick Railways, who says, I've hardly seen anyone try build the Licky Incline's Big Bertha. So that's not a bad shout, but I have seen at least one person try Big Bertha, and that is a friend of mine called Seth Britt. I remember seeing a work in progress for a digital model, I don't know how long ago, but yeah, I mean, Big Bertha is a big chunky locomotive, and it's not something I've seen modelled in physical bricks either. So it's not quite on my list, but I would like to see someone else give it a go. So Sam Brown has submitted an essay, and frankly, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I mean, that's just a bit ridiculous. I mean, let's be real. But skimming through this, there are a few locomotives that stand out. I can see Triplex, I can see the Pennsylvania Q1, S1, T1, and a few that I feel like are a bit familiar, but I'll have to double check and do some research on some of these. As well, I can see Double Fairley, and he even finishes by saying, I could go on, but I can't take up the whole video on my own. So a couple of these I've actually kind of done. When you look to the S1, the Q1, the T1, and the triplex as well, that's kind of been integrated and inspired some of the giants from the first and second eras. So it's kind of there, but everything else seems way too specific. A double fairly is something I've actually tried as well. I made a pretty bad version of a blue double fairly when I first got into narrow gauge. I would like to try that again in the future when I get my narrow gauge loop up and going, but with everything that's there, I mean, I've technically kind of done some of them, so I'm going to count that. The Cathal suggests some Brunel gauge stuff. Basically, he means broad gauge, and that is very interesting in of its own design. So, of course, broad gauge is wider than the standard gauge we have today. Now, in terms of translating that to Lego, I would believe that would be maybe 6 studs between the rails compared to the standard 4. You know how narrow gauge has 2 studs between the rail. I feel like that's a nice balance going upwards. Now, there is a particular locomotive, I'm pretty sure this is a broad gauge locomotive, where it's like a tender engine with loads of tiny wheels and one massive drive wheel in the middle. I have seen it before, the name escapes me, but that as a design I would love to try one day. If it's a broad gauge locomotive, then sure, I can give it a try. But I feel like this is another one of those things where I'm not quite there for it. I would rather see someone else give it a go first. But then again, I would like to try a version of that particular locomotive on the standard tracks. Just one massive drive. That would be one hell of a thing to see. That would be so cool. So maybe one day. That has been on and off. But in terms of broad gauge, as an actual gauge for Lego track, I want to see someone else try it first. Matthew Evans 97 has come along to suggest the Lionel World Cruiser locomotive from Lionelville Destination Adventure, and also the Jules Verne time train from Back to the Future Part 3. So that first train, not familiar with at all. But the second one, oh yes, now that could be cool. This is one of those trains, of course, it appeared in a film, so it's going to be much more recognisable. Now I have seen a few people make that locomotive without all of the time machine gadgets on it, but making the full time machine version of the train would be cool to do. I do remember trying to make that in the past. It was many years ago. And I also remember seeing a particular version of that mock at a Lego show, again about 5 years ago maybe. It was at the Swindon Great Western Lego show. Well, now it's called Steam, but it was that show. And it looked amazing. So if I'm ever in the mood to have a particular train to have as a display piece, maybe I'll give that a go. Of course, I'll make it so it can run on tracks, but at the same time, it definitely fits having it on its own display piece. In the same way we got the Crocodile locomotive that had its own track, and of course last year's Hogwarts Express that had its own kind of setup display piece. I feel like this Back to the Future train would fit that more so than being something to run on track. Again, it can have it run on track and that'd be really fun for people to point out and go, oh, it's that one. But yeah, that's how I feel towards it. The next suggestion comes from Solihull Train Spotter, and he says an S160 or Duke of Gloucester. So Duke of Gloucester is actually quite interesting. The only BR standard I've ever built was a 9F. I am kind of tempted to give that another go because the upgrade I made from when it was a 7 wide model to making it an 8 wide model was disgraceful. But at the same time, I do like my express passenger engines, and Pacifics in particular are like my bread and butter. So Duke of Gloucester, it's not a bad shout. Sadly, I don't really have interest in the S160, but the Duke of Gloucester kind of just appeared out of nowhere for me, and interest is slowly creasing up. So very maybe one day. I don't use this as like proof that I am going to make it one day. Don't quote me on anything. But it's interesting. That one is interesting to me. Genuinely, I might make it one day. Joanna Guayo Planel? Moments like this where you go into the comment section and you just see some crazy usernames. What even is this? Anyway, this person suggests the ridiculous Holman locomotives. So just a quick bit of research to make sure I know what he's on about, and these are the locomotives that were basically built to be put on stilts. Fascinating story as to why they were built. But, no. Islington Bricks has come along to say a South Australian Railways 620 class. So there is a streamlined variant of this locomotive, and straight away it has my interest. Now, I am British and I tend to stick to making British engines, but that isn't exactly strict. I have a streamlined passenger service from America's Santa Fe, and I would like to maybe have a few more passenger express services in the future, just to have more sets. So if this has a matching rake of coaches, it's not impossible. NSWGR Productions with a much more reasonable list, with a War Department 280 or 210, Dark Railway DR 1202, a Great Western Cathedral, a Caledonian 800, a South Australian Railways T-Class, and a Great Western 3900 class. Dark Railway DR 1202? What the heck is that thing? Okay, so there's some train simulator. Oh, that actually looks familiar. I remember seeing the video on that. It's a fictional locomotive, basically, using elements from the Midland and Great Western Railways. That's, okay. So I used to build a lot of custom locomotives before I finally took the jump in about 2018, I think it was, to finally make some real-life locomotives. And making custom stuff was a bit tricky because, of course, you got nothing real to base it on, so the simple design really stood out. Now, of course, I do have reference pictures here, but at the same time, it's a very interesting design, and there's a side of me that likes it, but I very clearly don't like it enough to want to make a version of this out of Lego. So as for the other locomotives he mentioned in his list, some of them, pretty much all of them in fact, I don't really have the interest in. Again, I've made so many locomotives over the years, it's not really sort of there for me. But I will give a quick nod because he mentioned Caledonian. Whilst it's not the class that he mentioned, the 123 class, which is the Caledonian single, that was on my to-build list for a good while. I'm actually quite upset I never got around to making it. But my god, what a beautiful machine. I would genuinely love to give that another go. So I got to be honest, you've kind of reignited that fire for me to want to make this. So if anything, again, it's not quite what you suggested, but a Caledonian single, that would be cool to have. User Nathan the Jet says, make Puffing Billy, but standard gauge, not narrow gauge. If you go onto YouTube and onto Flickr, you will find somebody has already done that, and it's a pretty good model. Okay, coming in with another list. Oh, for goodness sakes. Anyways, he says the Holman locomotive, that thing. The Reed MacLeod locomotive. Oh my god, my spelling and my pronunciation is horrible. The Union Pacific GTEL, HK Porter Rolling Ingot. The Franco Crusty Quadruplex. The GT3. The Dean Single. The Streamlined J3A Hudson. An F Unit. Pennsylvania Railroad Shark Nose locomotive, a streamlined K4, and a New York Central jet train. So of that list, there were two things that stood out to me. A lot of the stuff there was kind of hit and miss. There was some stuff I go, yeah, that'd be interesting, but that would be pretty much it. But again, the two that stand out, first of all, that streamlined Hudson. It's such a beautiful locomotive, it really is. However, Tony Sava is a Lego train builder based in Texas, and he has made probably the best version of that locomotive in Lego ever. And I genuinely encourage you all to go and have a look at it if you haven't already, because again, it's so well built. It's captured so perfectly. I don't want to make one, because if I ever want to, well, have that feeling of wanting to make one, I could just go to his Flickr and just stare at it all day. It's so good. Was it darker than it was a moment ago? Hang on, let me go put a light on. That's better. Yeah, that's brighter. Yeah, okay, let's go from here. So yes, the second locomotive that caught my attention in that list was the GT3. So the gas turbine Mark III was an experimental diesel type locomotive, and it's very interesting because it's a tender engine, but it's a diesel. Well, maybe not quite a diesel, but it's definitely not a steam engine. And I would love to give that a go. That was another locomotive that was on my to-build list. And the idea I particularly had with this was to build it in white to represent the Octan livery that I tried in the past. So a few years ago, I made a BR08 shunter diesel, and I built it in white with some red and green accents to represent Lego's Octan sort of livery. That was the idea, and of course Octan is Lego's own sort of fuel company thing for their city sets. And for any diesel I want to make in the future that isn't a Thomas character, I would like to have this sort of universal octane fuel livery, basically. And again, just talking about it now, it makes me want to make one. So I might have to put that back on the list. The final comment I'm going to be reacting to comes from the great Stapley? Anyways, they also suggest the GT3BR gas turbine locomotive. So I have basically just covered this, but I would like to add another point. I have only seen 2 people make this. One is from a fellow LUKR clubmate called Dan, the guy who runs TechBrick. Shout out to TechBrick for getting Lego Train fun stuff into the UK. And the other guy is on Flickr by the name of Hod Carrier, and that is a gorgeous design build. So I honestly feel more tempted now to give that a go. I might really have to put it back on the list. But yeah, the GT3 is pretty cool. So those were all of the comments that I got on that particular community post for me to react to in terms of Lego Train suggestions. Now again, I've had hundreds of comments in the past, and I got to be honest, I'm tempted to go back and see how many I can find to try and make a part 2 to this, because this was fun. This was genuinely so much fun to react to, because again, I get loads of these all the time, and there's 2 things you need to remember with this. First of all, this is going to be as far as it goes. Reacting to this was its own cool project, but you suggesting a model will never lead to me actually building it. Again, when I mentioned the Caledonian single and the GT3 earlier, I requested these comments, and the fact that they said them here was like, oh yeah, I remember wanting to make that. So there's kind of situational in a way to the fact that I may potentially make those models in the future. Them saying so has not directly meant they are the reason why I'm going to make those models, if I make them. The other thing to that is people making these suggestions, it's a combination of a few things. So take me, for example. I have a social media platform to where I'm building Lego trains. And if you have your own platform to where you're building models, and you've had someone say to you, I'd like to see you make this locomotive, I'd like to see you give this train a go. It's them basically saying, you have the parts, the talent, the skill, the build methods, everything you need to make a cool Lego train in my eyes. So I would love to have this Lego train made. I like this particular locomotive. I've got Lego bricks, but I don't know how I would make it. You clearly know what you're doing, so I would love to see you make it. And it's kind of flattering in its own way, because I can understand where they're coming from. But always remember, just because you're making these suggestions, again, it does not mean it's going to happen. However, I cannot stop you from making those comments, so if you have any suggestions, I suppose put them in the comment section here. I genuinely would love to do a part 2 because this video was a lot of fun to make. And that will mark the end of the video. Thank you everyone so much for watching. If you want to see a part 2 to this, then let me know in the comment section as well, because again, this was a lot of fun. But if there's no demand for it, then I'm happy for this to be its own one-off goofy fun project. In the description, you can find links to my social media pages, including a link to Lego Ideas, where I've put my Queen Miracle Express train set on there to hopefully become a set in the future. Follow the link, give it a support, give it a follow, and share it around to make it a potential future train set. Thanks again, folks. Always remember, ever onwards.